Over the past 8 months, I'm sure you've seen some sort of news channel or publication cover stories about the ongoing protests and civil unrest in Hong Kong. And since I'm from Hong Kong, I think it's important for me to address this topic and to talk a bit about how it might affect my future. And to just give a little bit of background and context about the protests, I'll briefly cover the history of Hong Kong. Hong Kong used to be a British colony until it was handed back to China in 1997 under the One Country, Two Systems framework. Now, this framework would effectively give Hong Kong an independent judiciary, its own police force, and human rights that are typically not allowed in mainland China, such as the rights to protest and the rights to free speech. And the protests that began last April were triggered by the creation of a new bill that says that it would extradite fugitives back to China for trial under their notoriously opaque and injudicious legal system. And Hong Kong citizens are scared that China would gradually encroach on our freedoms and our civil liberties. And in response to that, many radical protesters have resulted to violence as a form of retaliation from the Hong Kong government. And in my argumentative essay, I argued that it was a mistake for radical protesters to forsake the moral high ground of peaceful and nonviolent protests. Here's why. Imagine yourself as a pro Beijing supporter or a mainlander living in Hong Kong. Imagine being afraid of leaving the house every day just because you would potentially face some sort of prejudice for speaking Mandarin instead of Cantonese. Imagine yourself being physically attacked by pro-democracy protesters simply because you hold a differing political opinion. Even for myself, I am a supporter of the pro-democracy movement, but I still think it's immoral for protesters to commit acts of violence against pro-Beijing supporters, even if they intend to do them in the name of a noble cause. Also, intensifying the levels of violence would completely undermine the purity of the movement because the point of the movement is not to destroy the political system, but it's to make it more accountable and ultimately more democratic. And the protests have been going on for months on end now, and I think at this point it's safe to say that no amount of violence is enough to achieve the protesters' five demands, because essentially the Hong Kong government is acting as a puppet, as as a puppet of Beijing, and is taking the CCP's orders in response to the riots and the violence. And although the violence has already escalated to such an extreme level, all the government has done so far was withdraw the extradition bill, and they've ignored the rest of the four demands. And by ignoring the demands and allowing the city to basically become paralyzed, the government has made it very clear that they're willing to pay a high price in terms of bloodshed, in terms of economic performance, and in terms of social cohesion in order to avoid any meaningful compromise with the pro democracy party. And since Beijing and the Hong Kong government are most likely not going to give in to the movement, violence will not only be ineffective, but it will also do a lot of harm to Hong Kong citizens. And it's precisely this damage done by the protesters that has diminished the amount of support and participation from the rest of the pro-democracy supporters. And as a citizen that supports peaceful movements, I can attest and say that most pro-democracy supporters are willing and they're able to engage in less violent or non-violent forms of protesting, such as voting, such as mass demonstrations and consumer boycotts, as opposed to committing illegal and extreme acts like vandalism and assault. And over the past 2 months, the coronavirus pandemic has forced a close on the previous chapter of the violence and the protests, but Hong Kong is stuck in a long term battle for democracy. And we all know that after the pandemic ends, the next phase of the movement will start. So, given the current circumstances, I think it's I think the protesters should regroup and revise their approach because what we've seen so far from the last half a year is that violence is neither effective nor sustainable. And as difficult as it may seem to do, I think this form of recognition would both be a wise and necessary decision for us to make.